It was such a lovely experience 25 years ago that actually we've talked over the years to try to, how could we work together again?
When Barry Gibb first met Barbra Streisand, he didn't expect to feel intimidated, but standing across from her in that studio in 1980, something shifted. He'd written for legends before, but never for someone who made him nervous to sing. Both were at breaking points. Barbra feared her career was slipping. Barry was still haunted by the backlash that nearly destroyed the Bee Gees. Then came Guilty, an album that didn't just revive their careers, it bound them together in ways neither could explain. Now, after more than 40 years, Barry Gibb has finally revealed the truth. What happened in that studio wasn't just music, it was healing, faith, and the kind of connection that never fades. And what he said about Barbra left fans speechless. In the late 1970s, fame had become a double-edged sword for both Barry Gibb and Barbra Streisand. They were adored, respected, envied, but quietly uncertain about what came next. For Barbra, the lights of Broadway and Hollywood had already crowned her an icon, yet she could feel the air changing around her. Younger voices were taking over radio, and the perfectionism that once drove her had begun to feel like pressure. Each new project carried the same silent question: how long can I stay on top? Across the Atlantic, Barry Gibb was facing a different kind of crisis. The Bee Gees had conquered the world with Saturday Night Fever, but by 1979 the backlash was brutal. Disco, once the heartbeat of a generation, had become a target. The brothers who wrote its anthems were suddenly symbols of excess. Barry watched audiences turn their backs, and he felt the sting of being mocked for the very sound that had made him. For the first time in years, the man who could write a hit in a day wasn't sure anyone wanted to hear it. Both were standing at a creative cliff. Barbra needed reinvention, Barry needed redemption. Fate brought them together in a way neither could have planned. When her team approached him about producing new material, Barry hesitated. Working with Barbra Streisand meant stepping into a world defined by control, precision, and impossible standards. But he also sensed opportunity, the chance to write not for charts, but for emotion. Their first meeting was electric. Barbra wanted something fresh yet timeless. Barry arrived with melodies floating in his head and lyrics that reached beyond disco's glitter. He played a few chords, and she stopped him mid-phrase. "That's it," she said softly. It was the beginning of Guilty. The partnership felt effortless, yet charged with tension, the kind that exists when two perfectionists recognize equal strength in the other. In those early sessions, they shared more than musical notes. Barbra spoke about feeling boxed in by expectations, about wanting to sound alive again. Barry listened, understanding every word. He too was searching for meaning beyond applause. When they stepped into the booth together, the room fell silent. Two worlds, Hollywood glamour and pop genius, collided, and something transcendent emerged. Their voices blended like they were meant to. Barry's falsetto wrapped around Barbra's steel-soft tone until neither could tell where one ended and the other began. There was laughter, exhaustion, even moments of frustration, but always connection. By the time Guilty began to take shape, it was clear they weren't just making an album, they were rescuing themselves from the weight of their own legacies. Outside that studio, critics were waiting. Some doubted the match, calling it strange, even risky. But inside there was a quiet confidence. Barry knew the songs were special. Woman in Love, Guilty, What Kind of Fool, each track carried emotion that couldn't be faked. When Barbra sang his words, they came alive in ways he hadn't imagined. What neither of them could know was that Guilty would become more than a comeback. It would define an era of elegance and honesty in pop music. And for Barry, it marked the moment he found his voice again, this time through hers. Still, there was something deeper he couldn't name yet. A bond forming between them that went beyond music, something that would stay hidden for decades. From the first recording session, something about the chemistry between Barry Gibb and Barbra Streisand felt different. Barry wasn't just producing another star, he was working with a woman who demanded perfection and gave it back tenfold. Every line, every harmony, every breath mattered to her. Yet instead of resisting that intensity, Barry leaned into it. He admired her control, her artistry, her quiet command of the room. In her presence, his usual swagger softened. For once he wasn't leading, he was learning. Barbra had never worked with someone who understood emotion the way Barry did. His writing came from instinct, not structure. He could sit at the piano, hum a melody, and suddenly uncover feelings she hadn't realized she could still express. Between takes, they'd talk about music, fame, fear, and the strange loneliness that followed both. He told her about the pressure of living up to the Bee Gees' name, and she shared her doubts about still belonging in a world obsessed with youth. Somewhere in those long conversations, they stopped being colleagues and became confidants. The album took shape quickly, but it was never rushed. Barry and his brothers crafted songs that played to Barbra's range while revealing new vulnerability. When she recorded Woman in Love, her voice trembled in places not from weakness but truth. Barry guided her softly from behind the glass, and when she finished, there was a long silence before anyone spoke. It was clear they'd captured something timeless. Between sessions, they shared small human moments. Barry would tell jokes, easing tension in the studio. Barbra, usually guarded, began to laugh freely. There were stories about their families, their fears, the cost of fame. When Maurice Gibb visited, Barbra treated him like an old friend. To the Gibbs, she wasn't a distant superstar. She was someone who understood what it meant to keep performing while carrying private pain. When the record was complete, it didn't just sound good, it felt alive. Guilty wasn't a reinvention, it was a resurrection. Critics who had dismissed Barry's writing found themselves stunned by its sophistication. Barbra's voice, framed by his melodies, carried both power and grace. Together they built a sound that wasn't disco, wasn't pop, wasn't ballad. It was its own universe. What few realized was how personal it was for Barry. After years of being branded a fad, he had rediscovered purpose. Barbra had given him that. She reminded him that real music wasn't about chasing trends, it was about telling the truth. And in return, he gave her something she didn't know she was missing, a sense of freedom. For once, she didn't have to control every detail. She could simply feel. When Guilty was released in the fall of 1980, it became a phenomenon. It topped charts around the world, won Grammy Awards, and redefined both of their careers. But beyond the sales and acclaim, there was something deeper, mutual gratitude. Barbra called Barry a genius with heart. He called her the most extraordinary artist I've ever known. Their connection went far beyond the songs. It was built on trust, respect, and the shared understanding of what it costs to stay human in a world that worships perfection. Even after the sessions ended, they stayed in touch. Barry would later say that every time he heard her voice, it brought him back to that moment, the studio light, the stillness, the feeling that for once everything made sense again. When Guilty became a global sensation, so did The Whispers. The intimacy of those duets, the way their voices intertwined, it all felt too real, too emotional to be just performance. Fans saw something unspoken between Barry and Barbra, something neither confirmed nor denied. They smiled through questions, sidestepped speculation, and let the music speak for them. But behind the cameras there was no scandal, only an affection rooted in admiration. Barry was married, deeply devoted to his wife Linda, and Barbra, ever cautious about her personal life, had learned long ago to guard her heart. Yet, when they stood beside each other on album covers or stage appearances, the connection was undeniable. There was warmth, ease, and something deeper, a shared recognition of what it meant to be misunderstood. Each had carried the weight of fame for decades, and each had found in the other someone who truly understood the loneliness of constant spotlight. During interviews, Barry was often asked what it was like to work with Barbra. His eyes would light up before words followed. "She's unlike anyone else," he'd say. "When she sings, you don't just hear it, you feel it." It wasn't flattery, it was reverence. He admired how she could balance perfectionism with vulnerability, how she turned every song into a confession. For Barbra, the feeling was mutual. She called Barry the best partner a singer could have, someone who gave her songs that felt lived in, not written. As the years passed, the rumors faded, but the fascination remained. Fans sensed that what they shared couldn't be categorized. It wasn't romance, but it was intimate. It wasn't friendship, but it was loyal. It was a creative bond that mirrored love without the chaos of it. In truth, that was what made their connection endure. They needed each other not as lovers, but as reminders that greatness can still be human. In private moments, Barry often credited Barbra for helping him rebuild his confidence after the Bee Gees' decline. She didn't just sing his songs, she believed in him when few others did. For an artist who had spent years being both celebrated and mocked, that faith mattered. And for Barbra, Barry represented something rare in her world. A man who didn't try to control her, but who saw her completely and let her lead. Their respect was unbreakable. When they reunited in the early 2000s to record Guilty Pleasures, the old chemistry returned instantly. Decades had passed, their lives had changed, but that invisible thread between them still held. Barry's hair was silver now, Barbra's voice more mature, yet when they sang together again, it was as if no time had passed. The emotion wasn't nostalgia, it was continuity. What they never said publicly was how much that reunion meant. Both had faced loss and aging. Both had watched the world move on from their kind of music, and yet in that studio, they proved something timeless. Connection doesn't fade, it deepens. The tenderness you hear in those later duets isn't performance, it's history, it's gratitude. It's two artists who once helped each other survive the hardest chapters of fame, now singing not for charts, but for closure. And when Barry finally spoke about those sessions years later, he didn't talk about sales or legacy. He talked about her, about how Barbra had reminded him that art could still be sacred, about how even after all the noise, one genuine voice can restore faith in the music itself. When Barry Gibb received the call from Barbra Streisand in the early 2000s, he hesitated. Decades had passed since Guilty. The music industry had changed, audiences had changed, and both of them had grown older in a world that rarely forgives age. But as soon as he heard her voice, that same spark from 1980 came rushing back. Barbra wanted to make another album together. She called it Guilty Pleasures. Barry didn't need convincing. He knew instantly this was destiny coming full circle. By then, life had etched its lines on both of them. Barry had weathered heartbreak and health scares. He had said goodbye to Maurice, his closest brother and creative twin. The loss haunted him. Every melody reminded him of what was gone. Barbra, too, had faced her own solitude. After decades of control and acclaim, she had retreated more into her world of privacy and gardens, finding comfort in creation, not crowds. When they met again, their reunion wasn't just about making music, it was about remembering who they were before the noise, before the grief. The sessions took place in Miami, just as before, but this time the energy was quieter, deeper. Barry no longer needed to prove anything. Barbra no longer felt the pressure to dominate. They sang together like old friends rediscovering the meaning of time. Between takes, they shared stories about children, loss, and faith. Barry often mentioned Maurice, and Barbra listened, really listened in that still way only she could. The emotion between them was no longer youthful excitement. It was tenderness born of survival. When they recorded Stranger in a Strange Land, the lyrics hit differently. Barry's falsetto had mellowed with age, Barbra's range had grown richer, and together they sounded not like pop idols, but storytellers looking back on everything they had lived through. Each song carried reflection instead of ambition. In the pauses between lines, You could almost hear them breathing, unguarded, honest, free. Barbra once said that working with Barry again felt like coming home. He didn't challenge her, he understood her. He knew when to push, when to pull back, when to let silence carry more weight than sound. He called her the gold standard, and every time she sang, he treated it like a sacred event. The respect they shared, once professional, had become almost spiritual. When Guilty Pleasures was released in 2005, the world received it not as a comeback, but as a reunion between two souls who had never truly parted. Critics praised the maturity in their voices, the calm wisdom behind every lyric. Fans who had grown up with them found comfort in knowing that their heroes still had something to say, that love, art, and grace could evolve instead of fade. The cover image, Barry and Barbra, smiling, side by side, white against white, became a quiet symbol of enduring artistry. Behind the scenes, Barry spoke of that project as a gift. After losing Maurice, he had felt creatively hollow, but Barbra's call reignited something in him, a reminder that music could still heal. For her too, it was renewal, the chance to revisit an era when making music meant intimacy, not algorithms. Together they captured what few artists ever do, the sound of peace. Their reunion proved that time doesn't always take, it refines. What began as two stars chasing reinvention ended as two friends creating reflection. And in that stillness, Barry found the courage to say what he hadn't before, that Barbra Streisand wasn't just a collaborator, she was the turning point in his story. When Barry Gibb finally spoke about Barbra Streisand in his later years, it wasn't in a documentary or a polished interview, it was quiet, almost hesitant. He was being asked about legacy, about who had shaped him, who had reminded him of the meaning behind all the success. And that's when her name surfaced, not as a headline, not as gossip, but as gratitude. He said working with Barbra changed his life, that her belief in his songwriting came at a time when he had stopped believing in himself. He talked about how she treated his melodies with care, how she carried his words as if they were her own. She made me feel like what I wrote still mattered, he admitted softly. For a man who had seen the rise and fall of trends, the loss of brothers, and the ache of fading relevance, that validation meant everything. In his voice, there was no trace of nostalgia, only reverence. He wasn't speaking about the charts or the fame. He was speaking about connection, about how one artist's faith can keep another from giving up. He said he'd written hundreds of songs in his lifetime, but the ones Barbra sang had something different, something sacred. It wasn't romance. It was renewal, a moment when two worlds touched and made each other whole. Barbra, for her part, never downplayed that bond. When she looked back on her career, Guilty always made her smile. She called it effortless, natural, music that seemed to write itself. But what she didn't often say publicly was how much Barry's warmth anchored her. In an industry filled with ego, he brought humility. In a world that prized control, he brought calm. When they stood together, there was no competition, no tension, just mutual awe. Barry's later reflections revealed something deeper still. He confessed that after Maurice's death, he found it difficult to even enter a studio. The silence was too heavy, but when Barbra asked him to record again, he felt a pull he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about honoring her request, it was about healing himself. Her call gave him purpose when he needed it most. "I don't think she knew what that meant to me," he once said. "She reminded me that I could still feel joy in the music." Their story, in the end, was never about fame. It was about timing, how two people can find each other exactly when they need to. Barbra's strength balanced Barry's vulnerability. His warmth softened her edges. Together, they created something that lasted longer than trends, truth. That was the real revelation. When fans hear Guilty today, they hear a love story. But for Barry, it was a story of faith. Faith in artistry, in resilience, in the ability to start again. Barbra wasn't the love of his life, but she was the artist who gave him back his own, and that's the truth he finally revealed, not through scandal or confession, but through gratitude. Even now, when he speaks of her, his tone shifts. It's gentle, respectful, tinged with memory. "Some people come into your life for a moment," he once said, "but some moments last a lifetime." For Barry Gibb, that moment began in 1980 under studio lights, with one voice that matched his in power, grace, and purpose: the voice of Barbra Streisand. When the world talks about Barry Gibb and Barbra Streisand, it often mentions awards, platinum records, and chart-topping duets. But those who listen closely can hear something deeper, a conversation between two hearts that spoke through music. Their voices may have come from different worlds, but together they built a sanctuary, a place where faith, friendship, and melody lived in harmony. Decades after their first collaboration, Guilty still feels alive because it was born from truth, not fashion. It captured two artists standing on the edge of change, choosing courage instead of comfort. Barbra rediscovered her spark, Barry rediscovered his purpose. And when they met again for Guilty Pleasures, that spark became a soft flame, steady, enduring, reflective of everything they had survived. What remains most powerful about their story isn't the success, but the tenderness behind it. Barry found healing in her belief, and Barbra found peace in his presence. Together they proved that artistry doesn't fade, it evolves. That even in a world built on noise, silence between two people who understand each other can create something eternal. Their friendship became a quiet promise that music made with honesty will always outlast time. It's why listeners still play Woman in Love or What Kind of Fool and feel the same pull of emotion. Those songs were never just hits. They were prayers disguised as pop, two voices reaching for light and finding it together. And so when Barry Gibb finally revealed the truth about Barbra Streisand, it wasn't scandal, regret, or confession. It was gratitude. For the music they made, for the solace they gave each other, and for the rare gift of being understood completely, even just once in a lifetime. For more emotional stories, check out this video.